Think of this particular door, we think of course, all the great things that have gone on behind that door and in front of the door. Most recently, we've had a change of government with, of course, the Conservative Party being removed and the Labour Party now taken over. But cast your mind back to when we had truly great leaders. You know, the big ones that I'm talking about, the likes of the brilliant Sir Winston Churchill, a man who even to this day is still recognised by a simple image around the world. And as many people realise, he had a wonderful connection to our brilliant British royal family. This particular picture was unheard of at the time, and it's hard to imagine how just it sort of broke boundaries, because this was literally the celebration of victory in Europe, and they invited, of course, Sir Winston onto the Buckingham Palace balcony, a special invitation by His Majesty the King and the Queen. And of course we know her as, I know her particularly as the Queen Mother, a very kind, gentle soul who saw the value in people and more importantly put a lot of faith inside Winston Churchill, not just because of his leadership skills, but for what he did for her, her family, and of course the rest of the United Kingdom. Not many people know, that behind the scenes the Queen and Winston had a very special relationship, so much so that she made sure that extra food was sent down here and to, of course, his own particular private rooms to make sure that he kept his strength up. They were very concerned about exactly how it would play out literally during the war years. And by that, what I mean is, greens from the gardens at Windsor, the meat ration, anything that was left over from the royal kitchens, that sort of stuff. But with Winston, she also did this very special idea that not many people know about. You see, she decided that obviously people going through terrible atrocities across the United Kingdom, and in particular in London, where it got bombed so incredibly badly, as I know places like Coventry did, Southampton, Bristol, places like that. But what was fascinating was she decided, along with Mrs. Churchill, to organise special packages, literally, greens, apples, fruit, leftovers from the royal kitchens, as I said, and they would be delivered without notice to the most needy families, say in the likes of the East End, things like that. And that was all done through Winston and the Queen. She didn't want recognition for it. She basically said this is her way of trying to help get through. But there was a problem. There was a moment when that particular royal friendship sort of fell apart for a little bit, and it was regarding this. Let me explain. 2 months after the demise of that particular event, the Second World War, then Winston Churchill decided to make out a very special visit, to visit here. And this was the problem, you see, because then, very interestingly, even though Harry Truman was going and there were a few other people, well, His Majesty the King said he wouldn't mind going too. And this was a problem. You see, the problem was that they didn't necessarily, or should I say Winston didn't necessarily feel that this was in the best light, not just really for the British public, but indeed for His Majesty the King. Let's not forget their family connections and all of that sort of stuff. Now, while many people rode out those sort of connections, including the film star Marlene Dietrich, there was still a great deal of suspicion. But what a lot of people were very suspicious of was the fact that, was this demise absolutely 100% true? And that's apparently why His Majesty the King wanted to tag along. Now, as you can see from these pictures, the bottom line really was that he went alone and then was told to report back to the King and the Queen. And they basically said, are you 100% sure? And apparently Winston said he was, and that was the deal and that sort of thing, But consequently, it had a bit of a fractious moment in that relationship, because this was very much the first time that the sitting British Prime Minister had had something of an argument, shall we say, in that sort of period for a very long time. They'd sailed through all of those years without having a cross word. Of course, very quickly they decided just exactly how powerful and in much demand Mr. Churchill was. He was a great leader, there's no two ways about it. Hence the reason he was invited onto the balcony. But it went bigger than that, of course, because behind the scenes, many people truly knew how ill King George was. His health had been failing for many years, and more importantly, people were very concerned about the future. Now, as we also know, Princess Elizabeth and Margaret really were slightly kept into the dark about exactly how ill their father was. But what happened was King George basically made a promise to Winston that he would, if possible, help guide her through whatever was necessary in the future. And according to that source, who was literally part of the team, well, the bottom line was that's what cemented their friendship. And as you can see from these pictures, very early on, and as well as being her very first British Prime Minister, the Queen and Winston bonded over many different things. She saw him at times as a surrogate father. And even though, of course, Winston and her father almost fell out over this one glitch in their relationship, he stood by what he said. And more importantly, he never forgot about the ration packs, the ideas that Queen Elizabeth had to help people less fortunate than her. These are the stories that don't get put out there about the British monarchy, because at that time, Queen Elizabeth and the King didn't want that. They didn't want people to know, simply because they didn't want people to think that the Great Britain was struggling. They didn't need that out in the public domain. Many years later, he privately thanked her and said without her and her ideas, apparently of which there were many that she was never credited for, he didn't know where he would have been. And that really is how Winston Churchill and Queen Elizabeth had such a strong friendship and bond for the rest of his life. Neil Shawn, 10 Downing Street, London.